The last time that we met, we talked about Achan. We're in Joshua chapter 9 tonight. Last time we met, we talked about a man named Achan and how he stole from some things that had been banned. God had put a ban on any kind of plunder from the city of Ai, or from Jericho rather, and he broke that ban. He kept some things, and so when the Israelites went to fight their next battle at Ai, they suffered a loss and found out that it was because there was sin in the camp. This man had done this. And so they killed him and his whole family. They took them all, stoned them, left them under a pile of rocks. And then they renewed the covenant. They put the law. They made an altar and they put the law. They wrote the law on it. And they offered sacrifices. And went through the law and the blessings again. Talked to each other, shouted those things to each other. And it was really a reminder of first that Israel's not perfect. In fact, Israel wasn't any better than the other nations. They were just like the other nations. But God had, for whatever reason, had chosen them to do what he wanted to do. And he told them that. We'll read some of that tonight, Deuteronomy. But it was also a reminder that God is faithful to the covenant. God keeps his promises. And now we're in Joshua chapter 9. We're going to read chapters 9 and 10 both together tonight. This book is a narrative. It's not like Romans where you might have a ton of theology packed in just one little verse. We need to see the whole story. Figure out how this all fits together and why it's here. And I'll tell you before I get into it that Joshua chapters 9 and 10, the chapters are potentially very offensive. Some of the stuff that's said here, some of the stuff that we learn about God here is hard to accept, or it can be hard to accept, especially if you just pick it up and read it, and you don't keep the entire context of everything, including just the historical setting and the theological things that are going on. So I want to give you that background. I know I've kind of done it with earlier chapters, but I want to outline that again, give you a little bit of an understanding of what is going on, where they are, and preface it. First, I want you to keep in mind the fall in the garden and the promise. What was going on there? Well, Adam and Eve was deceived and Adam rebelled against God, and because of that, they brought sin and death into the world. And that whole chapter, Genesis chapter 3, tells about this curse that was brought into the world. Cursed is the ground because of you. And the serpent is cursed. He has to crawl on his belly. And the man and the woman both suffered death because of it. There's now sin in the world. And because of that, there was separation from God. And it doesn't get better. It didn't end with their deaths. It was passed on to their children and to their children and their children, on down to us, where all of us have this depraved nature, this brokenness. So that when Paul wrote to the Romans, remember what he said to them in chapter 3, there is none righteous, no, not one. In fact, because what we're going to read about tonight is very violent, I want you to go back and you can just listen, but it's Romans chapter 3, verse 10, about the violence of man, the violence that we're prone to do. There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understands. There is none that seeks after God. Okay, so there you take their righteousness and set it out of the way. You can set their religion and set it out of the way. They are all gone out of the way, and together they become unprofitable or useless. There is none that does good, no, not one. Now, listen to what it says about their actions, our actions. Their throat is an open grave. The words that come out of our mouths are like death. The seat of their being is like death, like an open grave. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of serpents, the poison of asps, is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. They run to it. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Well, this is the problem. When we read Joshua chapters 9 and 10, we have to read it with this context, that this is in a totally broken world. When we talk about victims and innocent people, just forget about that. This is who we're dealing with. There is none righteous, no, not one. None of the Canaanites were righteous. None of the Israelites were righteous. They're all equally depraved, equally unprofitable. And God's promise was to restore what was lost. God's promise was to defeat death and bring an end to the curse. And the way he does this, one of the ways that he does this is all part of the gospel. One of the ways he does this is through judgment. That's what happened in the garden. God came into the garden and he asked the man, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, the woman. Woman, what are you doing?" "Well, the serpent." He gets to the serpent and he begins right then. And he says, "Cursed." Well, that was judgment. God was using his power to apply justice to guilt. He was remedying sin in that moment. Judgment began there in the garden. At least as we see it played out. Judgment began there in the garden. That is the majority. Judgment is the majority of Revelation. When we've been reading through there with all the broken seals, with all of the blasted trumpets, with all of the poured vials, all of it is judgment against the world. There's a lake of fire that's waiting for all of the wicked to be gathered up and thrown in. Judgment was a major theme of Jesus' message. He talked about the wheat and the tares. Don't try to separate them. There's going to come a time when we're going to harvest all that. And then we're going to take the tares. We're going to bundle them up. We're going to burn them. We're going to get rid of them. He told parables about wicked servants who were bound hand and foot and cast into utter darkness. Judgment is a major theme in the New Testament. It's what makes the gospel such good news. What is the gospel? Well, we all know that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. And do you realize that anyone who does not believe in him is condemned already? That's what makes salvation so sweet. That's what makes grace so necessary, is that God takes the righteousness of Christ and gives it to us and takes our sin and puts it on Christ and fully judges it. It isn't a lack of judgment. It isn't withheld judgment. It is God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. And though how's he say it in Isaiah? The verse just popped up in my head. I don't remember how it goes. He laid on him the iniquity of us all. You know what verse I'm talking about? He laid on him the iniquity of us all, so that even though we all like sheep have gone astray, each of us according to his own way, and God has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. That's how it goes. We've gone astray. Our righteousness doesn't even exist. Our sins are like scarlet. But he makes us as white as wool. How? Through judgment. When he judges the wicked, he does it with judgment, and he gave Christ what we deserved. So judgment is the major theme in the garden. It's the majority of Revelation. It's the thing that makes the gospel sweet. It's a major theme in the New Covenant. And it's one of Israel's roles in the Old Testament. This is what I was talking about earlier, Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 5. Not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart do you go to possess their land. So he says, look, you're getting ready to go into this land and you're going to kill a lot of people. And you're going to do it in my name. You're going to do it because they're wicked, not because you're righteous. It is not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you go to possess these people's lands, but because of their wickedness. That's why the Lord your God drives them out before you. And the Canaanites, or we could say so the Canaanites, deserve judgment. There's none righteous, no, not one. And God has taken this group, Israel, and he says, you're going to go in and you're going to judge them. But it's not because of your righteousness. It's because of their wickedness. I'm using you to pour out judgment on them. And they did deserve it. They were guilty of witchcraft and idolatry. You can just read through the scriptures and see. They go by a bunch of names. They're the Hivites and the Hittites and the Amorites. And all of them make up this land called Canaan. So just in general, they're called Canaanites. That's like the big umbrella. But there's a bunch of people, a bunch of different groups under that name. And when you read the Old Testament, you see that they were guilty of all kinds of idolatry. They were guilty of witchcraft. They tried to curse the Israelites. And, especially for them, you think about what Paul said. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth. God's wrath is revealed from heaven against those who suppress the truth. Because that which may be known about God is known to them. It's clear who he is, but they choose to reject that, for God has showed it to them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. The things that cannot be seen are seen in creation. It's obvious who this God is. These things are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. As we read through Joshua chapters 9 and 10, I want you to keep this phrase in your minds. They are without excuse. They are guilty and without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. So they suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. They knew the truth and said, I don't want that truth. I'm going to hold it down. I'm going to toss it out. I don't want that. They glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the only God for images of beasts. They began to practice idolatry. They changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, into birds and beasts and creeping things. So they were guilty of that, first of all. This is their cultural religion. They were also known for their sexual debauchery. They were debauched. You don't have to go into detail. You can just imagine the stuff that they did. There are verses that reference that they burned their children in fire. That was part of offering sacrifices to their gods. They burned their own children. They're thinking, if I give my child to God, then he's going to see, or to the gods, they're going to see how much I want to serve them and how sincere I am, and then they're going to bless us. So they offer their children up and burn them. These people aren't innocent. One of the warnings that was given to Israel in the book of Leviticus was, defile not yourselves in any of these things. Don't defile yourself by doing this stuff. For in these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. You'd have to be just like them. If you do these things, you're going to be just like them. I'm kicking them out for this reason. And the land is defiled. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomits out her inhabitants. That's a terrible picture, isn't it? The land vomits out the people who live there because they're defiled. And God he warned them, look, you don't become like them. You see what's happening to them? They're being vomited out of the land. That's what's going to happen to you if you become like them. Well, that is what happened. They did. They became just like those nations, and they were exiled into Babylon. The land vomited them out because of that. But it's not like they were without opportunity. It's not like they were without time. You remember what God told Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15? He said, your descendants aren't going to possess the land immediately. They're going to have to go off into bondage for 400 years. But then after that, I'm going to bring them out. And Abraham might have said, well, why can't they possess it now? And the answer is the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. The Canaanites, the meter's here. We're going to let it get up to here before we decide to do what we need to do. And so 400 years pass. There's that promise. They're going to fill the meter up, and then the land is going to vomit them out, but not before. And it happened. What God said to them is what's going to happen. And I want you to watch the difference in the reactions tonight. We're going to see two groups of people, two main sides here. You're going to see the Gibeonites, who use trickery to stay alive, basically submit to the Israelites. And you're going to see these other kings who come together and they say, we're not having this. You're not coming here, and you're not going to kill us. And it was self-defense, really. But it was self-defense against God. And they knew what they were doing, but they did it willfully. So as we read these chapters, and you start to go, man, how could God do this to these people? Keep in mind, there is none righteous. There is none who seeks after God. Keep in mind that these people are guilty of some of the worst crimes, especially with the burning of their children, with their debauchery, with their idolatry. And they knew. They suppressed the truth of God in unrighteousness. There's no one innocent here. The whole point of what God is doing is to make a holy place. Everything in the Old Testament is a foreshadow of what happens in the New Covenant. In the New Covenant, we are promised something like a land. Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, you may be also. We see the promise fulfilled in a little blueprint with Israel. And there's not going to be any wickedness in that land. God is going to clean it out. Of course, it's a type, it's a shadow, it's a picture, so it's not perfect. He had to fill it with imperfect people. But that's the mission. So what they're doing is important, and they can't make peace with the locals. You need to know this before we get into this story. There was a commandment. Deuteronomy chapter 7. When the Lord your God shall bring you into the land, and has cast out many nations before you, you shall smite them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them. You shall make no treaty with them. Don't make any concessions. Don't enter any alliances, nor show mercy unto them. Neither shall you make marriages with them. Your daughter shall not give unto you can't give your daughter to his son, nor his daughter shall you take for your son, for they will turn away your son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So, the Lord will be angry against you and destroy you suddenly. But this is how you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars and break down their images and cut down their groves and burn their graven images with fire. For you are a holy people unto the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a special people unto himself above all people that are in the face of the earth. So it's pretty clear what they're supposed to do, right? We're driving out the wickedness of the land. It's time for God to judge the land. And he's going to dispossess these people. They're gone. So Israel, as God's hand of judgment, when you go, don't show mercy. Don't make treaties. Take everything. But they were required to make peace with some of the foreigners. I want to point that out because this isn't some racial thing. You know, we think of holy war, we think of jihad, we put this maybe in the same category. It's not what it was. He's clearing out the land. He says, when you come to a city, now he's talking about a foreign city. Now, so just picture a radius. Everything inside this radius is the promised land. No deals here. But now, if you go outside of that radius, when you come unto a city to fight against it, proclaim peace unto it. That's what he says. This is Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10. When you come to a city to fight against it, proclaim peace. Let's make a deal. And it shall be, if they answer in peace and open to you, then it shall be that all the people that is found therein shall be tributaries unto you, and they shall serve you. So you're going to let them live. We're going to live. You have to pay tribute. They're still over them. They rule over them, but we don't have to wipe everybody out. That's not the purpose. Everybody outside of the promised land can live. If they will make no peace with you, if they want to make war, then besiege it. And when the Lord your God has delivered it into your hands, that's a key thing there. When God has given it over to you, you shall kill every male with the edge of the sword, but the women, the little ones, and the cattle, and everything that's in the city, all the spoil you can take for yourself. And you shall eat of the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. This is what you do to all the cities that are very far off from you, which are not of the cities of these nations, but the cities of these people, which the Lord your God does give you for an inheritance. Everybody inside of that radius, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, that they teach you not to do after all their abominations which they have done unto their gods, so you should sin against the Lord your God. We're going to clear this land out, and you can't leave anybody here. Because if you do, they're going to teach you to follow their ways. And that's not the point. The point is not to kill, the point is to clear this land. Because this is the land where God's people are going to live. So I want you to read it with these facts in mind. This is not unfair. It's not a racial issue. It's not even a land issue. It's not a bloodthirsty God on a kill frenzy. This is an act of justice and a removal of wickedness from where God's people are. So with that, let's start in Joshua chapter 9. I promise the introduction was longer than the sermon's going to be. I hope. Let's start in chapter 9. And here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to read chapters 9 and 10, and I'm going to read it from the New Living Translation. You can read it in the King James. It, to me, sometimes is unnecessarily cumbersome. And this doesn't say anything different. It just puts it in modern English. Okay? Joshua chapters 9 and 10 from the New Living Translation. Now, and I'm going to skip some of this stuff too, like where they mention all these names. Now, all the kings west of the Jordan heard about what had happened. They heard about what happened with Jericho and Ai and all this. These were all those kings who lived in the hill country along the Mediterranean Sea, and they combined, verse 2, their armies to fight as one against Joshua and the Israelites. But when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to deception to save themselves. They sent ambassadors to Joshua, loading their donkeys with weathered saddlebags and old patched wineskins. They put on worn-out patched sandals and ragged clothes. And the bread they took with them was dry and moldy. When they arrived at the camp of Israel at Gilgal, they told Joshua and the men there, "We've come from a distant land to ask you to make a peace treaty with us." So right here, you already know that they can't. It's illegal. The Gibeonites were 7 miles from where Israel was, from where they were camped right there. So they were very close. But they come with this lie. They got some old clothes, some old wineskins, some moldy bread. It's a trick. The Israelites replied to these Hivites, which are Canaanites, "How do we know you don't live nearby? If you do, we can't make a treaty with you." They replied, "We are your servants," which is no answer at all. Look, we're your servants. Just trying to get it off the subject. But Joshua demanded, "Who are you? Where do you come from?" And they said, they don't tell him where, they just describe it. "Your servants have come from a very distant country. We're a long ways off. We've heard of the might of the Lord your God and of all he did in Egypt." Notice they don't say anything about the local news. They don't say anything about Ai. It's too soon to know about that, so they're just pretending. "We heard about what he did in Egypt. We also heard what he did to the 2 Amorite kings over there on the other side of the river." So, verse 11, our elders and all our people instructed us, take supplies for a long journey, meet the people of Israel and tell them we're your servants and please make a treaty with us. This bread was hot from the ovens when we left our homes, but now, as you can see, it's dry and moldy. These wineskins were new when we filled them, but now they're old and split open. Our clothing and our sandals are worn out from our very long journey. So the Israelites examined their food, but they did not consult with the Lord. Then Joshua made a peace treaty with them and guaranteed their safety. And the leaders of the community ratified their agreement with a binding oath. 3 days after making the treaty, they learned that these people actually lived nearby. The Israelites set out at once to investigate and reached their town in 3 days. The names of these towns were Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack the town because the Israelite leaders had made a vow to them in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. The people of Israel grumbled against their leaders because of the treaty. But the leaders replied, since we've sworn an oath in the presence of the Lord God of Israel, we cannot touch them. This is what we must do. We must let them live. For divine anger would come upon us if we broke our oath. Let them live. So they forced them to be woodcutters and water carriers for the entire community as the Israelite leaders directed. So they basically made them like they would strangers, like they would aliens from any kind of a conquered nation that let them in. They made them like that. Joshua, verse 22, called together the Gibeonites and said, why did you lie to us? Why did you say that you live in a distant land when you live right here among us? May you be cursed. From now on, you will always be servants who cut wood and carry water for the house of my God. They replied, we did it because we, your servants, were clearly told that the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you this entire land and to destroy all the people living in it. But this is kind of like Rahab, isn't it? This is like Rahab on a national scale. We heard that you're coming and we heard that your God has given you this land. We're afraid. We didn't want to die. You see the difference here between this group and the first group? The first group heard they were coming and they bound together. Why did the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The Lord laughs. He's not afraid of them. But they're going to make their last stand. They're going to do it however they can. But not the Gibeonites. They say, look, we knew you were coming. We knew we were going to lose. We did whatever we had to do to survive. You made a pact with us. You swore on your God's name that we could live. So now what? We feared greatly for our lives. That's why we've done this. Verse 25. Now we are at your mercy. Do to us whatever you think is right. So Joshua did not allow the people of Israel to kill them. But that day he made the Gibeonites the woodcutters and water carriers for the community of Israel and for the altar of the Lord, wherever the Lord would choose to build it. And that is what they do to this day. Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured and completely destroyed Ai and killed its king, just as he had destroyed the town of Jericho and killed its king. So he knows too. He knows the same thing that they know. He also learned that the Gibeonites had made peace with Israel and were now their allies. He and his people became very afraid when they heard all this, because Gibeon was a large town, as large as the royal cities, and larger than Ai. And the Gibeonite men were strong warriors. So the king of Jerusalem sent messengers to several other kings. Verse 4, come and help me destroy Gibeon, he urged them, for they have made peace with Joshua and the people of Israel. So these 5 Amorite kings combined their armies for a united attack. They moved all their troops into place and attacked Gibeon. The men of Gibeon quickly sent messengers to Joshua at his camp in Gilgal, saying, don't abandon your servants now. Come at once, save us, help us, for all the Amorite kings who live in the hill country have joined forces to attack us. So Joshua, having had made this oath, apparently feels responsible, and his entire army, including his best warriors, left Gilgal and set out for Gibeon. This is the first time we hear the Lord speak in these 2 chapters. Do not be afraid of them, the Lord said to Joshua, for I have given you victory over them. Not a single one will be able to stand up to you. That's pretty much free reign, isn't it? You don't even need to plan, just go. Joshua traveled all night, verse 9, from Gilgal and took the Amorites by surprise. The Lord, now stop right there. Who did what? The Lord threw them into a panic. And the Israelites slaughtered great numbers of them at Gibeon. Then the Israelites chased the enemy along the road to Beth Horon, killing them all along the way to Azekah and Makkedah. As the Amorites retreated down the road, the Lord destroyed them with a terrible hailstorm from heaven that continued until they reached Azekah. The hail killed more of the enemy than the Israelites killed with the sword. On the day the Lord gave the Israelites victory over the Amorites, Joshua prayed to the Lord in front of all the people of Israel. He said, "Let the sun stand still over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Aijalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stayed in place until the nation of Israel had defeated its enemies. Is this not recorded in the book of Jashar? The sun stayed in the middle of the sky, and it did not set as on a normal day. There's never been a day like this one before or since when the Lord answered such a prayer. Surely the Lord fought for Israel that day. Then Joshua and the Israelite army returned to their camp at Gilgal. During the battle, the 5 kings escaped and hid in a cave. When Joshua heard they'd been found, he issued this command, saying, "Cover the opening of the cave with large rocks and place guards at the entrance to keep the kings inside. The rest of you continue chasing the enemy and cut them down from the rear. Don't give them a chance to get back to their towns, for the Lord your God has given you victory over them." So Joshua and the Israelite army continued the slaughter and completely crushed the enemy. They totally wiped out the 5 armies, except for a tiny remnant that managed to reach their fortified towns. Then the Israelites returned safely to Joshua. After that, no one dared to speak even a word against Israel. Then Joshua said, "Remove the rocks covering the opening of the cave and bring the 5 kings to me." So they brought them out, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. When they brought them out, Joshua told the commanders of his army, "Come and put your feet on the kings' necks." And they did as they were told. "Don't ever be afraid or discouraged," Joshua told his men. "Be strong and courageous, for the Lord is going to do all this to all of your enemies." Then Joshua killed each of the 5 kings and impaled them on 5 sharpened poles where they hung until evening. As the sun was going down, Joshua gave instructions for the bodies of the kings to be taken down from the poles and thrown into the cave where they'd been hiding. Then they covered the opening of the cave with a large pile of rocks, which remains to this very day. That same day, Joshua captured and destroyed the town of Makkedah. He killed everyone in it, including the king, leaving no survivors. He destroyed them all, and he killed the king of Makkedah as he had killed the king of Jericho. Then they went to Libnah and attacked it and did the same. From Libnah, verse 31, he went to Lachish and attacked it. Here again, the Lord gave them Lachish. Joshua took it on the second day and killed everyone, just as he had done at Libnah, leaving no survivors. Verse 34, Joshua and the Israelite army went on to Eglon and attacked it. He completely destroyed everyone in it, including its king, leaving no survivors. They did the same thing to all the surrounding villages. He completely destroyed the entire population. Then in verse 38, they turned back and attacked Debir. Same thing. Verse 40, Joshua conquered the whole region, the kings and people of the hill country, leaving no survivors. Just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded, Joshua slaughtered them and conquered all these people, verse 42, all these kings in their land in a single campaign, for the Lord, the God of Israel, was fighting for his people. Then they returned to their camp. Now, this passage is, you see why it's spent so much time on the introduction. It's pretty rough, isn't it? They go from place to place. And I can't imagine being one of those kings forced to lie down while someone puts his foot on your neck to show we're not afraid. But they weren't innocent. And this story is in the Scriptures for a reason. Christ says the Scriptures speak of him. We've seen that the gospel is on every page of the gospel, or on the Scriptures, and it's no different here. It would have been important for the early Israelites. It gives them a general history. They found out how they got where they are. But it also did a couple things. It was a warning of what happens to the wicked. Don't act like your enemies. I mean, it's one thing for God to say, the land's going to vomit them out. It's another thing for them to see the amount of blood and death and carnage all around them, because this is what sin does. This is what the judgment of God looks like. There's no survivors. Everyone has paid the price for this sin. Gives them confidence in battle, though, doesn't it? When God kills more of the enemy with his hailstones than you can kill with your sword, when God appears and says, go, it's a guaranteed victory. No one's going to be able to stand up against you. Gives them a little confidence. It's also evidence of God's intention to keep his promise. If he was going to give up on them, he should have done it at Ai. He should have done it when when Achan did his thing. When they found out, look, we're as guilty as the nations around us. We actually are no more righteous. What about that? Is God going to give us what we deserve, or is he going to give us what he promised? Well, God chose him. I'm not done. I made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'm going to keep that promise. All of these things that would have been helpful to the Israelites still speak to doctrine and theology today. What do we know about God? What does this tell us about Christ and the gospel? Well, I mean, one thing we see here is that God is a judge. Everybody wants to talk about the God of love. My God of love would never do that. Look, if God is only that way, who is this in the Old Testament? Who is this? This one who instructs them to wipe out entire groups of people within an area. They deserved it. None righteous. They put their children in fire. God hates sin. God hates wickedness, and he's not going to have it around his people. He's going to clear it out. But that points us to what we can expect from him. When he says, I will present you as a pure and spotless bride, you can read it like this. There's not going to be any more sin. What happened in the garden is totally undone. What happens in Revelation totally fixes the problem. His judgment removes sin and wickedness from the earth. That's why the Scriptures say it's a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. What a terrible, terrifying, frightening thing to fall into his hands as an Amorite or Canaanite or in the last day. He fights our battles. That's another thing we see. Not only does he fight our battles, he overwhelms our enemies. And the verse that comes into my head, just thinking of this in New Covenant terms, is the last enemy is death. Where, O death, is your victory? You imagine standing on that king's neck. This is a king. This is think about chess. This is the one. He's the guy. And I'm standing on his neck. He can't do anything about this. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? This is what we learn from reading these scriptures. The Lord delivered. The Lord fought. The Lord did everything. It was his battle, and he won it overwhelmingly. The last thing that I see here is that he keeps his promise to us despite our failures. It's a sad thing when people, they take this doctrine of eternal security and they say, well, you just think that means you can live however you want or do whatever you want. That's not what we mean. When I say eternal security, when I say once saved, always saved, what I'm talking about is that God doesn't give up. I'm no more righteous than anybody else. I'm just like Israel. I'm no more righteous. I didn't deserve that. He didn't choose me because I'm so much better than everybody else. He chose me because. And so if he chose me because, he keeps me for the same reason. Started with love. It's maintained by love. It's seen through by love. And this covenant doesn't get nullified because of my failures or weaknesses. All of my sin has been paid because of Christ. And that's the new covenant. That's what I see in these two passages. Come back next time, we'll pick up there. Jesus, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you for your power and might. We thank you for these stories. God, I pray that you would help us to take them seriously and to examine them wisely. We want to know that you're a just God and that you are a God of love. And we want to know that when we see these things, that it's not unfairness. It's not partiality. Help us to have the proper view of you and ourselves. The proper view of you and all men. And to make us realize how dependent we are on your mercy. And to love your grace for it and to proclaim your grace for it. Because those who come are saved. And those who don't, those rebels who will not, they are struck down to the last man. We look forward to the day when you give us the land that is free from wickedness. Until then, come quickly, Lord Jesus. Amen.